Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel and another video. In this week's video, I'll be showing you how I built this balustrade style coffee table. If you like the video and you think you may want to make this for yourself, check out the description where I've got a list of all the dimensions as well as the tools and products that I used in this video. So that's a long enough intro. Let's get right into it. So the first step in making this table was to get some wood. Clearly, if you don't have any wood, you wouldn't have anything to make a tabletop with. So we're stating the obvious at the beginning of this video, but anyways, these are the pieces that I used. This is actually some leftover 2x10 boards that I had from a bar I built previously. If you haven't checked out that video, definitely check that video out. I'll leave a link in the top of the screen here. But anyway, these were the leftover 2x10s that I had, and the first thing that I needed to do was to mill all these boards up nice and square. Starting with the planer on both sides, then going over to the joiner to joint one edge, and finally finishing it off on the table saw to cut the boards to width. When I was done, I ended up with 6 of these really nice clean boards, and everything was squared up very well. So we take 5 of those 6 boards and put them on the clamps to glue up. The 6th board that you don't see here will be ripped in half to make the breadboards, which we'll get to a little bit later in the video. But to clamp these together, I just put some bar clamps down, put glue on the seams, and then bar clamps across the top. Then I'll throw some of these small clamps on the edges just to make sure that the seams don't separate on the ends. One tip that I have with clamping is to gradually tighten each clamp individually rather than clamping one side all the way tight and then tightening up all the other clamps. A sign of a good glue up is squeeze out, and this right here is absolutely money. Well, it's not actually money, it's glue, but I think we knew that anyway. So I wiped all the excess money off the top of the tabletop, and then I left the clamps on for about 24 hours or so, or sometime until the same time the next day. Everything was dry, and then I could take the clamps off after that. Rather than try to cut all of the boards to the same length before I glue them up, I just flush cut both sides with the track saw. Track saw works awesome for this, and it works really well for getting a straight and flush flat line on the edges of a tabletop like this. If you're interested more in the track saw or any of the other tools in this video, be sure to check out the description below where I have a link to all of the tools and products that I used in this video. You probably didn't notice it in that last shot, but I cut through my tabletop with the track saw. So now my table has a little bit of extra character, and I'll always remember that I did that and try not to do that again next time. Earlier when I said that 6th board would be used for the breadboards on the tabletop, I was not lying. And here you can see that as I'm ripping that board in half to get 2 breadboards. I think the breadboards ended up around 3 inches or so thick. Doesn't really matter how wide the breadboards are. I just think that if you get any thicker than 3 or 4 inches, it kind of looks a little bit off, so I like to keep them a little bit on the thinner side. To attach these breadboards to the top, I'll be using dominoes, and this has quickly become my favorite and most efficient way to do this. So an easy explanation on how dominoes work for attaching the breadboards. First of all, breadboards need to be attached in a manner that allows for wood movement as the inside boards expand and contract. If you use pocket holes or dowels or something that isn't elongated, those inside boards will actually crack and come apart over time. So that breadboard has to allow the inside boards to move. Otherwise, you risk some structural integrity issues of the tabletop over time. So I used the domino to cut mortises on both the inside of the tabletop and the breadboards. Now on the inside of the tabletop, the tenon is the exact same size as the mortise, so the mortise that was cut will hold that tenon exactly in place and there will be no movement whatsoever. On the breadboard, however, there's a setting on the domino that allows that tenon to be cut a little bit wider, so that tenon will be able to float freely from side to side, which allows the inside of the tabletop to expand and contract. So that makes sense as far as keeping the breadboard on from side to side, but what about coming off of the table away from the inside pieces? To keep that breadboard pinned to the tabletop, what I'm doing here is measuring about 1 inch away from the inside of the tabletop, and using a Forstner bit, I'm going to drill through the breadboard right down into that tenon about halfway. You can see how the color of the wood chip changes. That way I know that I'm into the actual tenon rather than just the breadboard. And after all the wood chips have been sucked up by the vacuum, we're going to use a 1/2-inch poplar dowel rod to plug those holes. So the dowel goes through the breadboard into the tenon, and it can be glued in all the way. This will keep the breadboard tight to the tenon, but remember, as that inside piece expands and contracts, it can float a little bit in the breadboard because those mortises were elongated. This is a lot like drawboard joinery as far as traditional breadboards go, but on this, the mortise within the breadboard allows for the expansion and contraction rather than an elongated hole inside the tenon. After that, the only thing left to do was to flush cut those breadboards with the track saw, and then the tabletop would be finished. Until of course we sand it and detail it and all that good stuff, but we'll get to that later in the video. The bottom frame, upper frame, as well as the slats on this table will all be made from these 2x6 pine boards that I have here. So I started out with a bunch of these and I had to mill them up, just like I did the other boards. So we first face joint them, edge joint one side, run them all through the planer, and then again we'll rip them on the table saw to get that other edge cut to width. And one really important thing I learned here is that the dust collector works a whole lot better when it's turned on. You would think that by now I know that, but I guess I'm still learning. Anyway, if you haven't already thumbed up this video and subscribed to my channel, now would be an excellent time to do that on behalf of these super sweet camera angled table saw shots. Every like and comment that I get really helps my channel out, and that way I'm one step closer to giving my cameraman a well-deserved raise. Anyway, after those 2x6 boards were milled, I kept a lot of them away from the camera right now to be used for the slats, but I ripped 2 of them in half to give me 4 equal pieces on the bottom, which would make up the bottom frame. Now I didn't want a seam on the corners or at the feet of each of the pieces on the bottom frame, so I cut each one at a 45-degree angle, and then those angles will match up to form a square for the bottom frame. Here are all 4 pieces that'll make up the bottom frame, and these are actually the same length that the tabletop is, which I think gives the tabletop a better overall look and profile. So I tilted the blade to about 20 degrees and then cranked the blade way down to where it was only sticking out about 1/2 inch or so, and rather than add the feet to the bottom of this frame, I'm going to try to cut the middle section out to leave the feet on the end. That way it'll be a solid piece and you won't be able to see a seam where anything was attached. So I first cranked the blade down, and then with the piece over top, I raised the blade up so that it comes through as if you were cutting out a slot on a new table insert. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of a sketchy cut, and if you don't have the board pushed down on top, that's a huge kickback risk. So if you do this, just be careful. Probably wouldn't recommend this cut just for the reasons that I said, but if you do, make sure that you have that board pushed down. Otherwise, that board will become a projectile for sure. So one problem with the table saw is where the blade is curved, you can't make the cut all the way through. But if you just grab a pull saw or any other type of regular hand saw, you can make quick work of that. After the middle is cut out, you're left with a really cool profile, and like I said, those feet on the outside are actually a part of the board, so there will be no seam, and I think it looks a whole lot better this way. In order to keep this bottom apron nice and square and to prevent it from coming apart, I grabbed the domino, and then the domino has a cool setting where you can go to 45 degrees. Also, I felt like one tenon wouldn't be enough, so using these little notches on the end, I put a tenon on each side of each of the pieces, which would not only line them up better, but give them a little bit more strength altogether. After the mortises were cut out, we just put a little bit of glue, pop some tenons in there, and then all these can be put together. The thing I like about the domino is that it's very precise and it's incredibly accurate, not only for the breadboards, which we saw earlier, but also for things like this. You don't have to have a domino. You could use dowel rods or biscuits, or you could just glue these up with some corner mate type jigs, which would work fine, but those tenons work so well, and this is so efficient for putting tough angled pieces like this. So if you're on the fence deciding about whether you want a domino or not, I would say definitely go ahead and get it. It is an expensive tool, but it's expanded the things that I've been able to do so much, and you'll use it a whole lot more than you think you will. So the domino definitely gets 2 thumbs up for me, at least in my opinion. After we check to make sure that everything is square, all we need to do is throw a couple clamps on the sides and then let everything dry up overnight. So I debated with myself for pretty much the entirety of this whole build on how to attach the slats to the bottom of the table frame. And what I decided for the easiest and most cost-effective way to put the slats on would just to be use pocket holes from the inside of the frame up into each of the slats individually. I decided this, of course, after I had the whole frame put together. So if you were doing this, or if I was to redo this table, I would obviously cut the pocket holes on each of those bottom apron pieces before I had everything glued together, which would be a whole lot easier and save some time. That said, this did end up working out fine, so it wasn't really that big of a deal. A lot of times you'll hear that pocket holes do not properly allow for wood movement, and that is true if you have multiple screws holding one board in. But since I'm using only one screw right in the center of that board will not be attached on the outsides, so that board can still expand and contract across the grain, while that screw will keep it pinned down to the bottom of the apron. In order to keep all those slats equally spaced on the bottom, I grabbed my setup blocks and I found a block that would equally space them out to where there was no leftover gap on the end. I had to try this a couple of different times with different setup blocks, but in the end I think a 3/16 inch space in between each board left the spacing equal right where it needed to be without any major gaps. So I put just a tiny bit of glue down right in the center of each of the boards, just like that pocket hole, which will allow for expansion and contraction on the outsides, and then I put all of the slat boards on one by one. The reason that I'm doing this is to make sure that that spacing is equal. It's a lot easier to go one board at a time, plus it was a whole lot easier to clamp the boards individually rather than try to get them to all stay put and then flip the whole thing over. Just like I flush cut the tabletop earlier, I left all of these slats longer than they needed to be, and then I flush cut them with the track saw to where they were all equal with that outside apron. I also wanted to use those cutoff pieces, so after I had cut them off, I took them over to the table saw and cross cut everything to the same length. So typical to balustrade style tables, there's usually a square or rectangular block on both the top and the bottom of each table leg. Now, why that is, I have absolutely no idea. But if you look at pictures of balustrade style tables, that's what you see. And I didn't want to stray away from the classic look and get too wild on this table. And for that reason, I decided that I too would also put these random squares on the top and the bottoms of the table legs. On the top squares, I decided that I could build a small apron to attach the tabletop to, so that's what you see me doing here. I cut some upper apron pieces that would be attached to each of those squares, so I had to lay everything out on the bottom to make sure that it was spaced out properly to get that measurement for the length of the apron pieces. Once everything was all laid out and cut to length, I used the domino once again to cut mortises in each piece, and then I just used the tenons to connect them together, which made a really solid apron for the top. After that top apron was all assembled and glued up, I grabbed some bar clamps, threw them on the bottom and the top, and I left that apron to dry for a little while. In the meantime, I went ahead and sanded everything down. Sanding is everyone's absolute favorite part of a woodworking build, so I won't make you watch too much of that, but I did sand everything down to 220. To give the top a little more detail, I grabbed my palm router, I took a chamfer bit and rounded over the edges of that tabletop. Using a router on the edges is a quick trick that makes all of your builds look a whole lot better and can quickly take everything to the next level. So if you don't have a router, definitely consider investing in a small palm router to clean up the edges of the tabletops of all your builds. The next step in this build was to attach those squares and the top apron to the legs. These legs are from Carolina Leg Company. This is exactly how they came out of the box. So if you like how these table legs look, or if you're in the market for some different turntable legs, check out Carolina Leg Company. Also, I am not affiliated or sponsored by them. That is my honest opinion. I love their products and I've used them several times before and will continue to do so. Anyway, the squares and the apron are just attached to the legs using wood glue and screws. As long as you have the orientation of the grain in the same direction of the legs and the squares, you shouldn't have any issues with expansion and contraction. So once again, I grabbed the setup blocks and using them to measure equal spacing on the outside of each of the square, I centered up the legs and the apron, and then I flipped everything over after I had it clamped down. Once you have the table on its side, or if you could get it upside down, you can simply attach those legs to the frame using screws. So I put one screw through the slat into the bottom of the table legs, and then I backed that up with a couple other screws into each leg. So I used 3 screws overall on each leg. If you were not aware, you were just looking at Z-clips, which are one of my favorite methods to attach tabletops to table frames. So I'm taking a slot cutting bit in my router and cutting out some slots on the upper apron of this. This bit works awesome. If you do use this bit, just make sure to go slowly because there is a little bit of risk of kickback with that bit. But after those slots are cut out, you can just pop the Z-clips in each of the slots, and then you can use screws through those Z-clips to drill up into the tabletop and secure the tabletop to the frame. The reason that we are using these Z-clips is, like I've mentioned in this video several times up to this point, to allow for expansion and contraction of that tabletop as it does move with humidity and temperature differences. With everything assembled, all that was left to do was to paint and stain the table, so I grabbed my HomeRite paint sprayer for the paint. If you pay attention in the background, there's some friends that came to visit me. I'd bet to say that that's the first time on YouTube you've ever seen somebody painting a table where there's deer running in the background. Anyway, to finish the top, I stained it using a couple different stains. I started off with one color and didn't care too much for it, so I ended up mixing a bunch of the stains until I got the color that I wanted. I let the stain dry for a couple days, then I used polyacrylic matte finish as the clear coat on this. Ended up using 2 coats. I really like polyacrylic and I honestly don't use it enough. It's super easy to brush on and it gives a really nice finish that's a lot easier to work with than polyurethane. Once everything was dry, I put the tabletop back in place and then reattached it with the Z-clips. We already saw that earlier, so no need to see it again. But that'll finish this table up, so here's a couple pictures. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know in the comments. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.